Welcome to a Shot in the Arm podcast, coming to you live from the World Health Assembly in Geneva. I don't even know what day it is. It's the Thursday today. We've had quite a full week. And, well, a Shot in the Arm podcast wouldn't be at the World Health Assembly without meeting up with one of our favourite friends and leaders in the global health field, Elisha Dunn-Georgiou, who is the President and CEO of the Global Health Council in the US. Elisha, welcome back to a Shot in the Arm podcast.
Thank you so much. It's very nice to be here as a guest, not as a co-host. We had a great time last year, but it takes a lot of work to put this podcast on.
Oh, doesn't it? And look, no hands having to press buttons.
Exactly. Yes.
So it's been quite the week.
Yes, I would say, you started off by saying you didn't know exactly what day it is. I'm a little punch drunk. I know we're streaming live. I just want to apologize in advance if I say anything untoward. But yeah, it's been a really busy week, and there's a very packed agenda, a lot of seminal things, which I know we'll get to. I also think it's interesting to see the evolution of WHO post-COVID. Every year it's gotten a little bit bigger, and this year it is big, it is spread out. There are tons of people here. There's lots of side events all over Geneva. It feels actually a little bit like a health-specific UN General Assembly.
Yeah, doesn't it? And on one hand, I think that's a really good thing because regardless of what's going on around us more broadly, people are still taking health seriously. We may have forgotten COVID, but we're still taking it seriously.
Yes.
So I guess you, your team and your members will have been going to all of these sessions, stalking the corridors, finding out what's going on. But I guess starting first, the temperature of this meeting. We had the German strategist Katri Bertram on yesterday, and she used the word stagnation when it came to global health delivery, impact and investments. And she spoke about this sort of exhaustion that global health folks are feeling really post-COVID. Are you picking up on that?
Oh, yeah. I think that people are tired, and it feels very much an uphill battle, where I think for those of us, particularly in the advocacy community, who have been pressing policymakers so extensively on remedying some of the real inequities we saw during COVID, some of the missed opportunities on delivery of vaccines, slide back in essential services. You said we forgot COVID. I don't think that's the only thing that we've forgotten. And so in some ways, it feels like we're starting the conversation again, coupled with a very polarized political environment, layered with real concerns about financing. And someone referred to it as sort of heading toward the financial cliff in global health. And we see shrinking overseas development assistance, we see shrinking domestic health budgets, and there are a lot of health multilaterals, including the World Health Organization, asking for money, whether you want to call it a pledging moment or replenishment or investment round. Everybody uses a different name, but it's billions and billions and billions of dollars being asked for in the next couple of years. And a lot of, from my view, lack of clarity of where that's coming from and what the trade-offs are going to have to be.
And they're going to have to be big trade-offs. Global Fund, Gavi, the Pandemics Fund.
Right, and this is just health that we're talking about, right? There's IDA at the World Bank. I think the Global Environmental Facility is going to be asking for money. So there's just a lot. There's a lot of money, and that doesn't even count bilateral assistance or, strains on national health budgets.
You mentioned people forgetting things and sort of starting from scratch, which I think is a great place to take us to the Pandemics Accord.
Yes.
Because I don't know about you, but they're negotiating things that I thought we had sorted, certainly from the AIDS movement, over the years around equity of access, around sharing information about pathogens and others. But these are back to the fore.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch, especially the conversations or the points of disagreement in the pathogen access and the PABs, the pathogen access benefits sharing, and even the conversations around One Health, right? Because that's where you're also looking at kind of pathogen development. And it does seem like some of these issues were, and I'm going to say litigated, and I don't mean that in any kind of official UN language, but were debated, agreed upon. We had gotten somewhere, and where no one wants to sort of come. I mean, I wouldn't say no one. I mean, everybody is working incredibly hard to get some place, and I know just from conversations with the U.S. negotiators, I mean, they're putting in a tremendous amount of hours, and all the countries are. So there is a commitment to it. Can we get to some kind of agreement and really put those lessons learned into practice in a tangible way? I think that's the question. Or we don't want to come out with a sort of watered down high level political resolution. Like, there really needs to be some gravitas to it, and I think that's been part of the issue going back and forth around language. Yeah, it's a tough one, certainly. And civil society hasn't been as actively engaged as we would have liked. So I think that piece too was a real missed opportunity in trying to help socialize and build momentum for this, in different nation states that are maybe struggling. That piece, but also, provide some better evidence and technical advice to the negotiating bodies. Like, it seems to be very government centered
and very Ministry of Health centered. So there is
yes.
they're not reporting upwards, and so the trade people, the president's people are not.
Yeah, I mean, I think that took a little while in the U.S. certainly to get a real interagency, coordination going. It's pretty strong right now between the State Department, between our Health and Human Services, our Minister of Health, between the White House. But I think too, it's important to remember that in these international agreements, putting into practice what is in the agreement, it's not necessarily only about foreign assistance, right? It means changes to your country's national laws and policies and regulations. And like, from my view, that's always really where the heart of the work is. Everyone loves to see the signing, right? But it's the like civil servant lawyer in the basement, like changing the statutory language so that pathogens can be shared, and that's not as exciting and it takes longer, but it's not necessarily only about desires on international cooperation. There's a lot riding on it nationally for everyone.
Do you think the strategy to let's just get agreement on the things that we can agree with, and there are things we're not going to agree with, and that's fine. Do you think that was a smart move? My sense was the things that we couldn't agree on, trade policy, pathogen information sharing, these come right at the heart of what we need to do for the next pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the plan was. I don't know what the full plan was. I've only gotten snippets of the strategy. I think 2 years was incredibly ambitious, right? I mean, we talked a lot about this. Maybe we talked about it last year, but it's, there's the other binding agreement that went through WHO through this process around tobacco control. 6 years to get it, just the document, for a topic where there is 50, 75 years of evidence, conclusive evidence that there's a direct link between smoking or tobacco use and poor health outcomes. After that, 6 years, countries went back. They did whatever they do internally to make it happen. It's still being tracked. Some of those things that were put in the tobacco framework, great. People are doing great on them. Others, not so well. Like, there's a monitoring board, I mean, but so to do this in 2 years, as the world is coming out of a real sense of urgency and really wanting to move it among a bunch of very challenging geopolitical dynamics, it was a tough sell from the beginning. And so you really would need like master strategists, right, who could map all of that out. And I think instead what you have are very technical health folks who are maybe going back to their governments and asking questions and trying to put forward a good balance between public health practice and national interests, and not reopening things that have already been decided in prior declarations. But yeah, from the outside, we criticize it, certainly, and constructive criticism is helpful. But I just want to say, I understand like the immense task that this is. So let's hope now there's kind of two different proposals being discussed, right, to finish it either in 3 to 6 months, which is the preference of, I think, mostly the Africa bloc, or to take a longer time, 1 or 2 years, and that's coming from some of the like US, UK countries. They haven't made any decision.
Yeah. I think if it's a 1 to 2 year timeline, heaven help us, because that suggests we'll never do it.
Yeah.
And both of those two countries you talked about have elections this year.
Yes.
But
Yes.
Give us some good news. And I know your team were telling you, and I think they gave you some
They
information.
gave me a bunch of notes, which I think I can.
What was good?
So there's a few things. So the pandemic agreement has been the splashy news piece because it would be something new. There's already something called the International Health Regulations, which dictates how countries work together in emergencies and non-emergencies. Those are very close to being amended, and that would be a really important change that could be implemented immediately and would make a huge difference. So I don't want to lose that, right? That's much closer to agreement. I saw a draft and there was like some yellow lining, right? But so like almost there, we're almost there. So I think that would be, that's really needed. Like that needs to get done.
Isn't it just Russia that's thinking we don't want to do this week?
I don't want to always pick
You
Russia.
might think that I couldn't possibly comment.
It's not just, I think there's some disagreement across the board, but yeah, I think that's been an easier, and I use that term very lightly, but an easier path because it already existed. It's already within things, the sort of power of WHO, things countries agreed to. So that's not so much. But there has been a bunch of other things. WHO released its general program of work for the next 4 or 5 years. That was, resoundingly passed. It's a pretty interesting program of work, lots of ties to climate change, lots of other things in there. The gender piece in there, not as good as we would have liked to see that, but that's been, a hot topic.
A hot topic this week. But to press you on the general program of work, major feather in the cap of Tedros for getting that signed off here. But it's quite comprehensive. And some people have said that perhaps, it's a real dilution of the mandate at a time when resources, as you said at the start, are really, really tight. And given that with the investment round, we got a commitment from Qatar and I think Singapore and maybe Ireland, was that necessarily the smartest thing? Or was it a stroke of genius saying, well, look, you've signed this off. Now you've got to give us the money to do it.
Yeah, I guess it's either a stroke of genius or not, depending on how the tactic plays out. I think it's a time for some vision. I think one of the pros and cons of WHO and WHA is it's really in the weeds, right? It's like very technical. We're talking about different, singular words make a huge difference. Singular kind of positioning blocks make a huge difference. So, as the Director General or as CEO, right, it's your job in part to provide that bigger picture, a vision, and then once that's out there, say like, okay, let's dig in. How do we get there? And, I think any strategic plan should be sort of a living document, right? And that's what I think as an NGO. I'm sure as a bureaucracy, it's not as malleable as strategic plan of an NGO. But I think it's really important that he and his team centered health within the bigger geopolitical context. And that is really something that is hard still for people to understand, that health is not in a vacuum, not financing. Your body is not sort of wrapped in a bubble and diseases just appear, right? It's because you're breathing bad air or you're eating terrible food, you're exposed to toxins, you're laboring in, what was it today in parts of India, 122 degrees?
Yeah, 50 degrees Celsius.
So,
yeah. And being kicked out of your home and trying to find safe haven in another country.
Exactly, yeah. So, all of those things influence health. And, we can't just keep talking about health as if it's you're visiting the doctor and they're looking to see why is your knee bad and then they give you a prescription, they send you home. It's about where you live, what's your education status, what's your ability to buy food, do you have access to clean water, all of those things. So I think the pillars in there that really look at climate, look at migration, look at conflict, those are huge ideas and huge sectors to pull together. I'm not saying it's an easy thing, but somebody has to say, hey, everybody, these are all interrelated.
And do you think it's good that Tedros has done that? Or do you feel that it perhaps, it's perhaps tilting at windmills because there's really not a great deal that the WHO can do about it? Truth to power, maybe.
I think as the leading normative health body, saying it is a step in doing something about it, right? Like being silent on it. And he has not been one to be silent, which has been quite refreshing, I would have to say. And so, it's a choice you make about what your legacy looks like. And maybe you get criticized as a Don Quixote tilting at windmills, or maybe you end up being a man before your time, down the road. I don't know, but I think it's the right choice in the moment. The money question, just to get back to that, right? So $11 billion was the call. $4 billion comes in assessed contributions, a few little sprinkles of pledges there. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, and I think it's one of the reasons, as someone that advocates quite heavily for engagement with WHO from my own country, government, and sustainable financing, like we need to see some results from this WHA. And it's one of the reasons we need to see the international health regulation piece done, and why I wanted to uplift some of the other pieces, that have been good, because people will give you $7 billion if you're getting stuff done. Yeah. If you're not getting stuff done, they might give it to somebody else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, be good to talk a bit about gender. You mentioned your slight, less than happy reflections on how gender has been reflected in this meeting. And again, a number of people have said, actually, we're really at risk of regression here, going back to language that we thought we'd put to bed over a decade ago.
Yeah, I think it's been actually, we see this quite a bit at the United Nations forums, right? This kind of battles from opposition to reproductive rights, opposition to gender language. It's really heightened here in the past couple of years. Last year, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a decision to be made on the global plan of work for adolescent women and children. Yes. I can't remember. Sorry, I'm forgetting the full name of it. But that got held up for days, right? Over, giving women control over our own bodies. And so this year, though, it's been, I think, even more extreme. Things like member states are saying, well, we don't want to use the word persons. We want to use people, because persons somehow implies non-binary, or we want to change language so that it's not using gender transformative, but something of like progressing towards a gender friendly something or other, so So really rolling back, and I would say, I mean, there has also been what we're seeing is burgeoning kind of attention from traditional sources of opposition at the United Nations to what's happening at WHO, and that's been a real concern for us, particularly protecting the way that civil society and non-state actors get access to be in the official part of, WHO. There's a whole process. There's something called FENSA, the Framework for Engagement of Non-State Actors, pretty technical. But, there's a process that you apply, you meet other requirements, you get recommended, and then your recommendation is sort of just taken verbatim, that everything's in order, and you go. This last executive board, there was an organization, reproductive rights focused, that did not get through, and they revisited it this round and couldn't still come to a decision, and so now it's going to get kicked again to the next executive board. But there's been a lot of lobbying from anti-choice groups and others to really start like ramping up this kind of exclusion of that fundamental health right and best public health practice.
Well, that's right.
Yeah. So it's tricky. I would also just say on, when we start to bring in climate and conflict and other things, those folks that are in that sector may not be familiar with the existing language and agreed upon precedents. So we saw that a little bit in the climate change health resolution. That's maybe will be decided this time. I think it's probably on Saturday's agenda now. But I think that was part of the challenge, is that they didn't know what they should be putting in. And when things were challenged, they didn't have a sexual reproductive health and rights or HIV person. They're saying like, oh, no. We've already decided this. So there is some education between those sectors that needs to happen.
And really interesting you raised that, and I don't want to put you on the spot if you haven't covered this, but noticing that there is some surprising controversy from the civil society movement around One Health, and the idea that strict One Health commitments, and of course One Health is that interaction between humans, animals, the destruction of the environment, and putting us closer to pathogens that we might not otherwise come across. But this sense that these kind of vigorous commitments might actually have implications on trade policy for some of these middle-income countries.
It's interesting. So you all may know that in the United States, we're battling a avian flu and situation in the dairy industry and bird industry, agricultural industry. And I think it's just important to remember it's an industry, and so it's those kinds of discussions of trying to figure out like what matters to that group that the health folks just aren't thinking about. So there's a very slim economic margin on agriculture. And if you're a civil society organization that protects farm workers or other agricultural industry, many of the farm workers are women, by the way. So I think that's an important note, that, there's some dialogue of, obviously people don't want to get sick, right? I mean, being an agricultural worker is one of the more dangerous positions to have in the world. So you don't want to get sick, but you also don't want to lose your income. So how do we work on that together rather than just saying, well, you just have to throw out all of the antibiotics and, we're going to be taking all of this extra money from you to scope for pathogens, and you have to do it because it's One Health.
Yeah, and it's similar to perhaps some of the climate agreements. And again, emerging economies saying, well, hang on a minute, you northern industrialized countries have polluted the environment at the expense of everybody else, and now you want us to make the major investments. And I sort of sense there's something going on there with the One Health debate. And I think it's sort of incumbent on us, and particularly civil society groups, to, and I'm not saying that this is what either you or I do. I mean, we really don't, but take our northern liberal blinders off and just shut up and listen.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. There's not a lot of listening. And I sit on the board of the governing board of the Pandemic Fund, as a civil society representative, and we've been trying very hard to build a constituency of supportive civil society. And it's been striking to us, those of us in health, in the human health sense, of sort of how few relationships we have with the One Health community or with the community, again, the agricultural community, right? Because those aren't necessarily the same. The One Health community is usually very technical, like vector tracking group. But there's a whole set of people working in that sector that I don't think we're doing a great job of talking with when it's not a crisis.
Well, it's a little thing for us to think about in our program of work for 24-25. One last big question, and I'm not quite sure how to raise this. A lot of people here from all sorts of countries are very concerned about the outcome of the US election. And I've heard this...
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yes, and I've heard this phrase, toxic creamsicle, that is hanging over us. In other words, and I can say this, a second Trump presidency.
Yes.
Have you found a lot of people coming up to you and saying, "What the hell are you Americans doing?"
Well, I think we get that regardless of who's the president, honestly. There's a lot of concern. I just want to say it's not just the U.S. that's having an election with potentially poor outcomes. South Africa is counting their votes as we speak. And it's, being billed as like the year of elections. I think there's 70 plus total. I think 40 of those are national, level. UK's on that list.
Although hopefully, and I shouldn't say that, I should remain completely unbiased, but hopefully we stand the chance of getting a good government for a change.
Yes.
Anyway, sorry.
No, so I think there is obviously quite a bit of concern. Trump and his team and the Heritage Foundation, which is a very conservative think tank, which has put out something called Project 2025, which is like 9 bazillion pages of kind of what the plan is. It's a very clear roadmap.
To bring us to the Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah, even more than that, if that's possible. So in that Project 2025, there are 2 or 3 chapters for health and multilateralists that are really important. There's one on State Department, USAID. There's another on Health and Human Services. There's one on, I can't even remember. There's a bunch of different things in there that show you kind of what their suggestions are, and all legal suggestions too, right? Really using the system. And one of the things we benefited from in the first Trump administration is they didn't know what they were doing. They had a bunch of people who had never been in government trying to figure out how to move legislation, how to work with Congress, so it was a little bit easier to gunk them up. This time, and especially because we're also having congressional elections, so there's a chance that they could be same party in office either way, right? And then if it's Trump, they would just move forward. The Heritage Foundation proposal is scary, not as scary as this our interview that Donald Trump did with Time magazine. I think that was last month. Yeah. Where there's a point in there where he's asked something about would he adhere to a law basically, and he's like, well, not if I disagreed with it. There's a real teaser there of kind of an overthrow of the rule of law, and he likes to bluster, so it's some of it is a little machismo situation there, but I think we know things that will happen. We know under Trump there would be a withdrawal from WHO, cuts to UNFPA, cuts to UNAIDS, reimposition of the global gag rule, withdrawal of any and all, diversity, equity, inclusion language, gender language would be stripped. And those are just sort of the very easy, low-hanging fruit. I think attacks on civil servants, that's been always part of his plan, is to kind of gut the federal workforce. And he did that in part in the first term, and that was one of actually the most debilitating things for the Biden administration, of restaffing agencies with people who knew what was going on. And that, like Atul Gawande, who's the assistant administrator of global health for USAD, I think it took a year to get him in position. So it's not just I say not just, I mean, the degradation of human rights and health is terrible, but there's also all of these structural things that keep money flowing, keep programs going. And in the first Trump administration, our tactic was to turn to the Europeans, right? And say, hey, Sweden, hey, UK, hey, Norway, Canada,
and look at what is going to happen potentially in the European elections here.
So that's also a different, and that's why I want to put it in context of the 40 plus, because there's a real shift in the conservative, power. And even we see that already with overseas development assistance, that many European countries are using that, which is supposed to go to low and middle income countries, to deal with migrant issues internally.
You wouldn't be talking about the United Kingdom by any chance, would you?
What?
Well, anyway, well, thank you for that upbeat.
Sure. Should we end on a high?
I know. Well, look, no, there was one final question.
Yes.
We're recording this in the UNAIDS WHO building, and it has at times been a challenge to get guests up to this floor, and I was on point to come and rescue you should you be collared by security. But round your neck is a pass that identifies you, and you told me as an NSA.
Right, as a non-state actor.
Not as the National Security Agency.
No. So WHO refers to any non-governmental group as non-state actors. They don't use the common civil society vernacular. So when you get this badge, it's because you are an NSA in official relations with WHO under FENSA, the Framework for the Engagement with Non-State Actors.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's the term actor that I think is...
Oh, acting.
But hey, well, look, we've come to almost to the end of the week. We've come to the end of our time.
Other people will still be here burning the midnight oil.
Elisha, thank you so much
my
for
pleasure.
coming by and just giving us your sense of what's going on. We've got our work cut out for us this coming year.
That is very, very true.
And I hope to see you next year, if not well before.
I would love it. Definitely.
Super.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, that is it for this episode. Thank you so much to Elisha. Thank you to you for watching. Of course, you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Give us 5 stars. And finally, have a great day and a safe day, everybody.